long before anything interesting happened in history, before stories were told, and before moments were remembered. Most human time passed quietly, without meaning, without drama, and without urgency. As people moved slowly through their days doing ordinary things that did not require explanation. And in those days, the most important actions were not heroic or memorable, but repetitive and administrative, involving counting, recording, waiting, and confirming details that changed very little over long periods of time. And it was in this slow rhythm that early societies began to develop habits of record keeping, not because they wanted to remember the past, but because they needed to avoid confusion. And so they marked numbers, quantities, and names in ways that were simple and functional, pressing shapes into clay, scratching lines into wood, or tying knots into cords, each method serving the same quiet purpose of keeping track of what already existed. And these early records were not read aloud or admired. They were stored away, stacked carefully, and left untouched for long stretches of time, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, while the people who created them went on with their lives, repeating the same actions every day, waking, working, resting, and sleeping, as seasons passed without comment. And in places like ancient river valleys, where farming depended on predictable cycles, the records themselves became predictable as well, listing similar harvests, similar weather patterns, and similar obligations, written in nearly identical formats year after year, so that reading one record felt very much like reading any other. And scribes learned quickly that accuracy mattered more than creativity, and neatness mattered more than speed, and silence mattered more than conversation. And so rooms filled with people who did not speak much, who sat for long hours copying information they already knew, carefully rewriting the same figures that had been written before, checking totals that rarely surprised them, correcting errors that were small and unremarkable. And when a tablet cracked or a scroll tore, it was replaced without ceremony. The information transferred once again, slowly and patiently, into a new form. And this process repeated endlessly, not because anyone enjoyed it, but because it was necessary, and necessity rarely asks for excitement. And over time, these records grew in number, filling shelves, rooms, and buildings, turning storage itself into a quiet occupation, as someone had to decide where each item belonged, how it should be labeled, and when it might need to be retrieved, though retrieval was rare, and most documents remained undisturbed, collecting dust, absorbing the faint smells of their surroundings, and existing only as proof that something had once been counted, measured, or agreed upon. And as societies expanded, so did their paperwork, though the pace remained slow, and changes were incremental rather than sudden, with new systems layered gently over old ones, never fully replacing them, so that for long periods of time, multiple methods of record-keeping existed side by side, each doing nearly the same thing, each producing nearly the same results. And people adapted to these systems not with enthusiasm, but with acceptance, learning where to sign, where to mark, and where to wait, understanding that waiting itself was part of the process. And in this way, history continued not as a series of events, but as a continuous administrative background, a steady hum of documentation that followed humanity quietly, faithfully, and without interruption, extending forward through centuries in much the same way, changing in material, but not in purpose, always present, always dull, always ongoing. And as that quiet administrative background stretched further forward in time, it became so familiar that most people stopped noticing it altogether, even as it shaped nearly every part of their daily existence. Because while kings were crowned and monuments were built, someone somewhere was still writing down numbers, confirming names, and ensuring that small details aligned with previous records. And these tasks rarely earned recognition or memory, yet they persisted steadily, carried out by individuals whose lives followed predictable patterns, arriving at the same spaces each day, sitting at the same desks or benches, and performing the same motions with their hands, dipping pens, pressing seals, smoothing parchment, or aligning stacks of documents so that edges were neat and corners were square. And this attention to order was not motivated by pride, but by habit, because habit made long hours easier to endure, and the absence of variation reduced the need for thought, allowing the mind to drift gently while the body continued its work. And over time, the language of records became increasingly uniform, favoring phrases that left little room for interpretation, phrases that repeated themselves across regions and generations, so that a document written in one place felt almost indistinguishable from a document written far away. And this sameness created a sense of continuity that required no effort to maintain, as new clerks learned old formulas, copied old layouts, and followed old instructions without questioning their origin. And in doing so, they preserved systems whose beginnings were long forgotten, maintaining structures simply because they already existed, and in many cases because changing them would require explanation, and explanation was inconvenient. And so the safest option was always to continue as before, to write what had always been written, to count what had always been counted, and to file what had always been filed. And even when materials changed, when clay gave way to papyrus, and papyrus to parchment, and parchment to paper, the motion remained slow and deliberate, guided by the same calm expectations, producing records that were rarely read from beginning to end, but instead referenced briefly, consulted for a single detail, and then returned to their place, where they would wait again, sometimes for decades, untouched and unchanged, while the world outside moved gradually forward. And in this way, the pace of administration lagged comfortably behind the pace of life, absorbing changes slowly and smoothing them out over time, so that no single moment felt urgent and no task felt final, because everything could be revisited, rewritten, or reconfirmed later. And this understanding removed pressure from the process, encouraging patience rather than speed. And as a result, offices remained quiet, voices remained low, and movements remained measured, with pauses built naturally into the day, pauses to check previous entries, pauses to wait for approval, pauses to allow ink to dry or documents to be delivered. And these pauses were not seen as interruptions, but as essential components of the work itself, filling the hours gently and evenly, until days blended into weeks, weeks into years, and years into long stretches of time that left few distinct memories, only a general sense of having completed what was required. And even as administrations grew larger and more complex, adding layers of review and oversight, the overall sensation remained unchanged, because each new layer simply introduced another quiet desk, another careful hand, and another set of eyes scanning lines of text that differed only slightly from those written before. And so history continued not in dramatic leaps, but in small, nearly invisible adjustments, recorded meticulously and stored methodically, creating an ever-expanding archive of ordinary moments that asked nothing of the future except to remain consistent, dependable, and undisturbable. And because consistency was valued above all else, even small deviations were noted carefully and addressed without urgency, recorded in the margins or corrected in subsequent entries, not as signs of failure, but as minor adjustments within a system that expected imperfections and absorbed them slowly. And this tolerance for gradual correction allowed administrative life to remain calm, as nothing needed to be resolved immediately, and few decisions were irreversible, since almost everything could be revisited in the next ledger, the next register, or the next cycle of review. And this approach shaped the working environment in subtle ways, encouraging patience, discouraging haste, and reinforcing the idea that steady progress mattered more than visible results. And so those who worked within these systems learned to measure success not by completion, but by continuity, by the simple fact that the records remained up to date, that the shelves remained orderly, and that the process continued without interruption. And even during periods of uncertainty or transition, when leadership changed or borders shifted, the documentation carried on, adjusting its headings and dates while maintaining its familiar structure, providing a sense of stability that existed quietly beneath larger changes, and in many cases outlasted them. As regimes rose and fell, while the same forms were reused, the same categories preserved, and the same procedures, followed by new hands who inherited old responsibilities. And because these systems relied on repetition, training was simple and slow, passed down through demonstration rather than instruction, with experienced clerks showing newcomers how to align columns, how to phrase entries, and how to recognize the acceptable variations that did not require correction. And this transfer of knowledge happened quietly, without ceremony, often without written guidance, relying instead on observation and imitation, which reinforced uniformity while allowing the work to remain largely invisible to those outside it. And as time passed, entire populations interacted with administration only briefly, encountering it when they needed permission, confirmation, or recognition, filling out forms that mirrored thousands of others, waiting in lines that moved at an unhurried pace, and leaving with documents that looked nearly identical to those issued before. And these interactions were rarely remembered, blending into the background of life alongside other routine tasks, while the records themselves accumulated steadily, forming vast collections that documented ordinary existence in meticulous detail, preserving transactions, obligations, and acknowledgments that carried little emotional weight. And because emotion was unnecessary, it was excluded deliberately, leaving language that was neutral, restrained, and repetitive, designed to convey information without interpretation. And this neutrality created a uniform tone that extended across centuries, making it difficult to distinguish one period from another when reading the records alone. And so the passage of time became flattened within the archives, where years sat beside each other without hierarchy, each entry given equal space and attention. And this equal treatment reinforced the sense that no single moment mattered more than another, that all were simply part of an ongoing process that did not rush toward conclusions. And as long as the process continued, there was little need for reflection, allowing those involved to focus on the immediate task at hand, the next line, the next number, the next confirmation, completing each quietly and moving on without pause. And in this way, the rhythm of administrative history settled into a steady pattern that required no explanation and invited no interruption, continuing gently forward, unchanged in spirit, even as the world around it slowly transformed. And as the systems expanded further, they did so without drawing attention to themselves, growing outward rather than upward, adding more registers, more folders, and more classifications that divided information into increasingly specific categories, each one designed to reduce uncertainty rather than to create meaning. And this gradual expansion required space, leading to rooms lined with shelves, shelves filled with volumes, and volumes arranged in sequences that made sense only to those who worked among them every day. And even then, the logic was simple, based on order rather than insight, as items were placed according to date, type, or reference number, ensuring that nothing felt out of place, even if it was rarely accessed. And the presence of these archives created a particular atmosphere, one of stillness and muted sound, where footsteps were softened, voices lowered, and movements kept deliberate, as if the weight of accumulated information encouraged restraint. And within this environment, time behaved differently, stretching quietly as hours passed with little variation, marked only by the completion of small tasks that required attention but not creativity. And this lack of variation made the work predictable, allowing those performing it to settle into routines that required minimal adjustment, reinforcing a sense of calm that persisted even during busy periods, because busyness itself was measured, controlled, and distributed evenly, preventing any sudden rush or interruption. And when new methods were introduced, they were incorporated carefully, tested slowly, and adopted only when they proved compatible with existing practices, ensuring continuity rather than change. And so innovations often appeared less as transformations and more as subtle refinements, altering the tools without affecting the rhythm of work. As hands continued to move steadily, eyes continued to scan lines of text, and minds continued to focus on accuracy and consistency. And this focus produced records that were reliable but unremarkable, capturing details that mattered only within their specific context and rarely beyond it. And because of this, many records were never read after their creation, existing solely as placeholders for potential future reference. And this potential was enough to justify their presence, even if it was never realized. And over time, this accumulation of unused information became normal, accepted as a natural outcome of careful administration, and no effort was made to simplify or reduce it, since excess was preferable to absence, and completeness was valued over efficiency. And so the archives continued to grow, layer upon layer, each new edition resting quietly atop what came before, forming a continuous record of ordinary activity that extended forward without anticipation of an endpoint. And because these processes relied so heavily on routine, they created an environment where anticipation was unnecessary, as each day followed a familiar sequence that required no planning beyond the immediate task. And this predictability allowed the work to proceed smoothly, with little variation in pace or outcome, reinforcing a sense of stability that extended beyond the workplace into the surrounding community, where people came to expect that requests would be processed slowly but reliably. Forms would be reviewed carefully, but without urgency, and responses would arrive in due time, neither early nor late. And this expectation reduced anxiety, replacing it with patience, as individuals adjusted their lives to the rhythm of administration, rather than the other way around. And over time, this rhythm became woven into daily life, shaping schedules, habits, and even conversations, which often revolved around waiting, confirmation, and completion rather than achievement or excitement. And within offices, the passage of time was marked subtly, not by clocks or announcements, but by the gradual movement of paper from one place to another, from incoming to pending, from pending to filed, each transition small and deliberate. And these movements required attention, but not intensity, allowing the atmosphere to remain calm and subdued. And as materials accumulated, so did the knowledge of how to manage them, passed quietly from one worker to the next through observation and repetition, reinforcing a shared understanding of procedures that required little explanation. And this shared understanding created continuity even as individuals changed, ensuring that the process remained familiar regardless of who performed it. And in this way, administration became impersonal, yet dependable, detached from personality and preference, focused entirely on function. And this focus eliminated the need for interpretation, as most decisions were guided by precedent rather than judgment, with previous entries serving as templates for future ones. And when uncertainty arose, it was resolved by reference to older records, reinforcing the authority of the archive itself. And as a result, the past exerted a quiet influence over the present, shaping actions subtly and persistently, not through memory or tradition, but through documentation. And this documentation did not inspire reflection or emotion, existing instead as a practical tool that supported continuity. And because continuity was the goal, change occurred slowly, introduced carefully, and evaluated over long periods of time, ensuring that nothing disrupted the steady flow of work. And this careful approach extended even to moments of transition, when offices relocated, systems merged, or jurisdictions shifted, as records were transferred methodically, labeled clearly, and arranged in familiar patterns that preserved order. And this preservation of order maintained the same atmosphere of calm and predictability, allowing administrative life to proceed uninterrupted. And as years accumulated into decades, the effect of this steady rhythm became almost imperceptible, blending into the background of history as a constant presence that asked nothing and offered little, simply continuing onward, quietly, reliably, and without conclusion. And as this quiet reliability became expected rather than noticed, it faded further into the background, functioning as an unremarkable constant that framed daily activity without drawing attention to itself. And because it was always present, it rarely inspired comment, allowing people to move through their interactions with administration with minimal awareness, filling in familiar fields, signing familiar lines, and waiting in familiar ways, knowing that the outcome would be predictable and that surprises were unlikely. And this predictability removed urgency from the process, encouraging a slow and measured approach that prioritized completeness over speed. And so tasks were completed carefully, checked once, and often checked again, even when the likelihood of error was small, because certainty mattered more than efficiency. And this emphasis on certainty reinforced the habit of reviewing previous entries, comparing details, and aligning information so that it matched existing records, creating a sense of continuity that extended backward as well as forward, linking each new entry to those that came before. And as a result, the present was always anchored to the past, not through memory or storytelling, but through documentation, which served as a quiet reference point that guided decisions without demanding attention. And this reliance on records shaped the pace of progress, slowing it gently and evenly, ensuring that changes were absorbed gradually and that stability was maintained even during periods of growth or transition. And within this stable environment, individuals performed their roles with little variation, learning procedures through repetition and refining them through experience, rarely questioning their purpose and seldom altering their execution, because the system functioned adequately as it was, and adequacy was sufficient. And this acceptance fostered an atmosphere where ambition was unnecessary, replaced by consistency, as the goal was not improvement but maintenance, not innovation but reliability. And over time, this focus created a body of work that was vast yet understated, comprehensive yet unremarkable, documenting countless ordinary interactions without emphasis or interpretation. And these records accumulated quietly, expanding outward rather than upward, filling additional space without altering their character. And as new generations took on the responsibility of maintaining them, they did so with the same calm diligence, preserving the tone, structure, and pace that had been established long before. And this preservation ensured that the experience of administration remained largely unchanged across time, offering familiarity in a world that slowly evolved. And in this way, the systems continued, steady and unobtrusive, supporting daily life without becoming its focus, existing not as a subject of interest, but as a background presence that required attention only when it was briefly encountered, and then receded again, leaving behind a sense of order that did not demand recognition. And as this pattern repeated endlessly, it formed a quiet foundation beneath history itself, a continuous thread of routine activity that extended forward without anticipation of an ending, moving gently onward, moment by moment, entry by entry, without pause or conclusion. And because this foundation of routine was so deeply embedded, it shaped expectations quietly and consistently, encouraging people to approach their interactions with systems slowly and without resistance, understanding that progress would come in small, measured steps rather than sudden outcomes. And this understanding reduced frustration, replacing it with acceptance, as waiting became normalized and delays were seen not as obstacles, but as ordinary features of the process. And within offices, this acceptance translated into an atmosphere where nothing needed to be rushed, where tasks could be paused and resumed without consequence, and where unfinished work simply waited patiently for the next available moment. And this waiting was not empty, but structured, filled with minor actions like organizing papers, aligning stacks, reviewing previous entries, or preparing materials for later use. Each action small, deliberate, and unremarkable. And as these actions repeated day after day, they created a steady rhythm that required little conscious effort, allowing the mind to drift gently while the hands continued their familiar movements. And over time, this rhythm became comforting, providing a sense of stability that did not rely on excitement or achievement, but on the quiet assurance that everything was proceeding as expected. And this assurance extended outward into broader systems, influencing how communities interacted with authority, how schedules were arranged, and how obligations were understood. As people learned to plan around administrative timelines that were slow but dependable, and because these timelines rarely changed, they became part of the background structure of life, as familiar as seasons or daylight, and just as predictable. And within the records themselves, this predictability was reflected in the language used, which favored repetition and clarity over variation, producing documents that differed only in minor details, such as dates, names, or quantities, while maintaining the same phrasing, the same layout, and the same neutral tone. And this uniformity made the work easier to maintain, reducing the likelihood of misunderstanding and minimizing the need for interpretation. And when interpretation was required, it was guided by precedent rather than intuition, with older records consulted quietly and carefully, reinforcing continuity rather than change. And this reliance on the past ensured that even as circumstances evolved, the administrative response remained steady, adapting slowly and cautiously. And as a result, the overall pace of history, when viewed through these systems, appeared smooth and uninterrupted, with sharp edges softened and dramatic shifts absorbed gradually over time. And this smoothing effect extended to moments of transition, such as the introduction of new technologies, which were incorporated methodically, tested thoroughly, and adopted only when they proved compatible with existing practices, ensuring that the experience of work remained familiar even as tools changed. And so, whether writing by hand, typing on machines, or entering information into digital systems, the essential nature of the task remained unchanged, focused on accuracy, consistency, and completion, rather than speed or creativity. And this focus preserved the same calm atmosphere, even as screens replaced paper and storage shifted from physical shelves to virtual spaces, because the underlying principles remained constant, guiding behavior quietly and reliably. And as digital records accumulated, they mirrored their physical predecessors, organized into folders, labeled carefully, and stored for potential future reference, often without ever being accessed again. And this accumulation continued without comment, expanding steadily as more information was created, captured, and preserved, not because it was immediately useful, but because it might one day be needed. And this possibility justified its existence, even if it remained unrealized. And over time, the sheer volume of stored information reinforced the importance of order, encouraging further categorization and refinement, which in turn generated additional work that followed the same calm patterns. And so the cycle continued, self-sustaining and unobtrusive, producing a continuous stream of ordinary documentation that flowed quietly beneath more visible events, supporting them without competing for attention. And as this stream extended forward, it carried with it the accumulated weight of countless small actions, each insignificant on its own, yet collectively forming a stable framework that allowed daily life to proceed without disruption. And this framework did not seek recognition or praise, existing simply because it was necessary, and because it functioned. And as long as it continued to function, there was little reason to alter it. And so it moved forward steadily, entry by entry, moment by moment, maintaining its quiet presence as time passed gently on. And as that gentle passage of time carried everything forward without pause, the routines remained settled into place, repeating themselves with such regularity that they no longer registered as actions, but as a background state of being, something that simply existed alongside breathing and walking, unnoticed yet constant. And within this state, there was no pressure to conclude or to reach an endpoint, because the work was never truly finished, only momentarily complete. And each completed task quietly made room for the next, which arrived in much the same form and required much the same attention. And this cycle created a sense of endless continuation that felt neither heavy nor light, but neutral, balanced, and steady, allowing days to pass without distinction, marked only by subtle shifts in light through windows, the quiet sounds of movement in nearby rooms, or the gradual accumulation of completed pages resting in orderly stacks. And these pages, once stacked, waited patiently, knowing in their own silent way that they would soon be filed, stored, and largely forgotten, just as countless others had been before them. And this forgetting was not neglect, but fulfillment, as the purpose of the record was simply to exist, to be available if needed, and to remain undisturbed otherwise. And so the act of filing carried with it a quiet finality, a sense that something had found its place, even if that place was rarely visited again. And over time, the number of such places multiplied, forming vast collections that stretched across rooms, buildings, and eventually systems that spanned entire regions, all unified by the same calm logic of order and preservation. And those who worked within these spaces adapted their movements accordingly, stepping lightly, speaking softly, and approaching their tasks with the same unhurried focus that had been modeled for generations. And this modeling required no formal instruction, as it was absorbed naturally through repetition, observation, and time, shaping behavior subtly without ever announcing itself. And as new individuals entered these environments, they adjusted quickly, matching the pace, adopting the tone, and learning the rhythms that governed the work, until their presence blended seamlessly into the existing flow, adding continuity rather than disruption. And this blending reinforced the sense that the system was larger than any one person, extending beyond individual effort and persisting regardless of who participated in it. And this persistence created a quiet reassurance that did not depend on outcomes or achievements, but simply on the fact that things were being maintained as they always had been. And because maintenance was the goal, there was little incentive to hurry, to innovate, or to stand out, and instead the emphasis remained on consistency, accuracy, and calm attention, qualities that supported the slow and steady movement of information from one place to another. And this movement, though subtle, was constant, ensuring that nothing remained entirely static, even as everything appeared unchanged. And in this way, time passed gently within the administrative landscape, smoothing itself into a continuous present where past entries informed future ones. And future entries resembled past ones closely enough that the distinction between them became less important. And as this indistinction grew, it further softened the experience of time, making long stretches feel shorter and individual moments less pronounced. And this softening extended outward, influencing how people experienced waiting, delay, and process in their everyday lives, teaching patience through exposure rather than instruction. And as patience became habitual, it reduced tension and expectation, replacing them with acceptance of slow progress and quiet resolution. And so the entire system, from the smallest task to the largest archive, functioned as a kind of steady current, moving gently forward without turbulence, carrying with it the accumulated weight of ordinary activity, and continuing on without signaling its direction or its destination, simply existing, moment after moment, in the same calm and unremarkable way, allowing everything within it to settle, to rest, and to drift onward without urgency or conclusion. And within that unhurried drift, the smallest details continued to receive the same careful attention as larger ones, not because they carried greater importance, but because the system did not distinguish between them, treating every entry as equally deserving of completion. And this equality reinforced a sense of balance that removed hierarchy from the work itself, allowing each task to stand alone without comparison. And as a result, there was no rush to finish one thing in order to begin another, since beginning and finishing were simply parts of the same ongoing motion, and this motion unfolded gently across hours that felt evenly distributed, neither long nor short, just present. And as those hours passed, they were filled with quiet repetitions that required focus but not strain, such as reviewing a line for accuracy, aligning figures so that they matched earlier records, or confirming that a name had been spelled the same way it had been before. And these confirmations, though small, contributed to a broader sense of order that was maintained not through force or urgency, but through patience and habit. And over time, habit became the dominant guide, directing actions automatically and allowing the mind to remain calm and unoccupied. And in this calm state, there was little awareness of progress or delay, as both were absorbed into the steady rhythm of routine. And this rhythm extended beyond individual spaces, connecting offices, departments, and institutions into a larger network that moved at a similar pace, coordinated not by constant communication, but by shared expectations. And these expectations were rarely stated explicitly, existing instead as an unspoken understanding that things would take time, that accuracy mattered, and that consistency was preferable to speed. And because these principles were widely accepted, they rarely caused conflict, allowing interactions to proceed smoothly and predictably. And when questions arose, they were addressed methodically, often by consulting existing records, which provided answers that were already familiar in tone and structure, reinforcing the sense that most situations had been encountered before in some form. And this familiarity reduced uncertainty, replacing it with quiet confidence that the system would accommodate whatever was presented to it, given enough time. And so time itself became a resource rather than a limitation, something that could be used generously to ensure completeness. And this generous use of time softened the experience of work, making it feel less like a series of demands and more like a continuous process that unfolded at its own pace. And as this process continued, it left behind a trail of documentation that mirrored its character, orderly, neutral, and understated, capturing moments without emphasizing them, and preserving information without interpreting it. And this preservation extended forward, accumulating steadily as new entries were added alongside old ones, each fitting neatly into the existing structure without altering its shape. And as the structure grew, it maintained its clarity through careful organization, dividing information into manageable segments that could be accessed if needed and ignored if not. And this selective attention allowed the system to remain efficient without becoming hurried, as it responded only when required and rested otherwise. And in this way, it balanced activity with stillness, ensuring that movement never became frantic and rest never became idle. And this balance contributed to the overall sense of calm that permeated the administrative landscape, making it a place where nothing dramatic occurred and nothing was expected to. And as years passed within this environment, they left few distinct impressions blending together into a continuous present that felt stable and reliable. And this stability extended outward, influencing how people understood order, process, and patience in their broader lives, teaching them quietly that not everything needed to happen quickly, that waiting could be part of progress, and that repetition could be a form of continuity rather than monotony. And as these lessons settled in, they reinforced the very systems that conveyed them, creating a gentle cycle of expectation and fulfillment that carried on without interruption, without announcement, and without any need for conclusion, simply continuing onward in the same calm and measured way, allowing everything within it to remain steady, aligned, and at rest as time moved forward. And as that steady movement persisted, it did so without drawing boundaries between beginnings and endings, allowing each moment to blend softly into the next, so that the idea of completion became less important than the act of continuation itself. And within this state, there was no anticipation of change, only an acceptance of repetition, as familiar tasks returned again and again in slightly altered forms that required the same calm attention. And this attention was given without strain, guided by habits that had been formed gradually over long periods of time, shaping movements, decisions, and expectations until they felt natural and unremarkable. And as a result, the work unfolded quietly, filling the hours with small, measured actions that left little impression once they were finished. And these actions accumulated gently, forming patterns that were consistent enough to be reliable, but flexible enough to accommodate minor variations. And this balance allowed the system to remain resilient without becoming rigid, adapting slowly when necessary while preserving its overall rhythm. And within this rhythm, there was room for pauses that did not disrupt progress, moments when nothing happened and nothing needed to happen, because the absence of activity was understood as part of the process, rather than a break from it. And these moments of stillness were as essential as the moments of movement, providing space for order to settle and for attention to reset. And over time, this interplay between action and stillness created an environment that felt stable and self-sustaining, requiring little oversight, because it functioned according to established patterns that guided behavior quietly and consistently. And as individuals moved through this environment, they adapted to its pace, slowing their own movements, softening their voices, and aligning their expectations with the steady flow around them. And this alignment reduced friction, making interactions smoother and outcomes more predictable. And because predictability was valued, it was reinforced at every level, from the way information was recorded to the way it was stored and retrieved, ensuring that each step followed logically from the last. And when something did not fit neatly into existing categories, it was adjusted gently until it did, either by redefining its description or by creating a new place for it that mirrored existing ones. And this careful accommodation prevented disruption, allowing the system to expand without losing its coherence. And as expansion continued, it did so quietly, adding layers that rested lightly atop one another, each contributing to the whole without demanding attention. And this layered structure absorbed the passage of time gracefully, preserving older elements alongside newer ones without prioritizing either. And this coexistence softened distinctions between past and present, making them feel like parts of a continuous whole rather than separate phases. And within this continuity, there was little need for reflection, as the purpose of the work was not to interpret history, but to maintain order, and interpretation was left aside in favor of clarity, accuracy, and consistency, qualities that supported the smooth functioning of the system without introducing complexity. And as these qualities were practiced repeatedly, they became ingrained, shaping not only procedures but attitudes, encouraging a calm acceptance of slow progress and an appreciation for stability over change. And this appreciation reinforced the existing rhythm, making it less likely to be questioned or altered. And so the cycle continued, quietly reinforcing itself through everyday actions that required attention but not excitement, patience but not urgency, and presence but not intensity. And as time passed within this cycle, it left behind a sense of gentle continuity that did not announce itself, but could be felt in the absence of disruption, in the smooth flow of routine, and in the quiet assurance that everything was proceeding as expected. And this assurance allowed the system to continue without pause, carrying forward its steady rhythm into each new moment, each new entry, and each new day, without signaling a destination or an ending, simply moving on in the same calm and measured way, allowing everything within it to remain settled, balanced, and at ease as the hours drifted slowly onward. And as the hours continued to pass in that same gentle manner, they did so without accumulating weight or urgency, because each moment was given just enough attention to be completed and then released, leaving behind no demand to remember it. And this release made space for the next moment to arrive quietly, identical in tone and requirement. And so the sequence continued without interruption, forming a steady line of ordinary activity that stretched forward without emphasis. And within this line, the distinction between important and unimportant gradually faded, replaced by a uniform approach that treated every task as equally routine. And this uniformity simplified decision-making, removing the need to prioritize beyond what was immediately present, and allowing focus to remain narrow and calm, directed only at what needed to be done in that moment. And because the scope of attention was limited, it was easier to maintain, reducing strain and preventing fatigue from becoming noticeable. And as a result, work could continue for long periods without feeling heavy, filled instead with small, manageable actions that followed one another smoothly. And these actions, though repetitive, did not feel burdensome because they were familiar, and familiarity reduced the effort required to perform them, allowing movements to become automatic and thoughts to drift gently without disrupting accuracy. And in this way, the body carried out its tasks while the mind rested lightly, neither fully engaged nor fully disengaged, existing in a quiet middle state that was comfortable and sustained. And this state made time feel softer, less defined, as minutes blended into hours without clear markers. And the only indication of progress was the gradual change in the arrangement of materials, papers shifting from one place to another, entries filling pages that were once blank, and shelves becoming incrementally fuller. And these changes were subtle enough that they rarely drew attention, noticed only when someone paused long enough to compare before and after. And even then, the difference was modest, reinforcing the sense that everything was proceeding steadily but slowly. And this slow progression was reassuring, because it suggested stability and continuity rather than volatility. And as this reassurance settled in, it further reduced the impulse to hurry, encouraging patience as a default response. And patience became self-reinforcing, shaping expectations and behaviors in ways that aligned naturally with the existing pace. And within this alignment, there was little friction, as individuals adjusted themselves rather than attempting to adjust the system. And this adjustment happened gradually, often without conscious awareness, through repeated exposure to the same rhythms and responses. And over time, it became habitual, embedded in posture, tone, and timing, influencing how people moved, spoke, and waited. And this influence extended beyond the immediate environment, subtly shaping interactions elsewhere, as the habits of patience and order carried over into other parts of life. And these habits reduced tension by setting realistic expectations about process and outcome. And because expectations were met consistently, trust developed quietly, not in any individual, but in the system itself, which demonstrated reliability through repetition rather than promise. And this reliability required no reinforcement, as it was evident in the absence of disruption, in the smooth continuation of routine, and in the predictability of results. And as trust settled in, it allowed the system to operate with minimal oversight, relying instead on established patterns that guided behavior naturally. And these patterns were maintained through small, consistent actions that accumulated gently over time, forming a stable structure that supported daily activity without drawing attention to itself. And within this structure, time continued to move forward at the same unhurried pace, carrying with it countless ordinary moments that were recorded, stored, and then allowed to rest, contributing quietly to an ever-growing archive of routine existence. And as this archive expanded, it did so without altering the character of the work that created it, remaining calm, neutral, and understated. And so the process continued moment by moment, entry by entry, without urgency, without emphasis, and without end, allowing everything within it to settle into the same steady rhythm as the hours drifted gently onward. And as that rhythm carried on, uninterrupted and unremarked, it continued to shape the experience of time in subtle ways, smoothing sharp edges and softening transitions, so that change, when it occurred, felt gradual rather than sudden. And this gradualness made adaptation easier, allowing adjustments to be absorbed quietly without disrupting the overall flow. And within this flow, there was little awareness of progression toward any goal, because the goal was simply continuation, and continuation required nothing more than steady attention and calm repetition. And so each action followed naturally from the one before it, creating a chain of ordinary moments that linked together seamlessly. And this seamlessness reduced the need for reflection, as there were no clear pauses that invited it, only a gentle forward movement that encouraged presence rather than evaluation. And presence in this context was simple and unassuming, focused on alignment, accuracy, and completion rather than meaning or consequence. And because meaning was not required, it was not sought, leaving the work free from interpretation and the mind free from expectation. And this freedom allowed attention to remain light, resting on the surface of tasks without sinking deeply into them. And this light attention supported endurance, making long periods of routine feel manageable and even neutral. And as neutrality became the prevailing tone, it influenced the atmosphere around it, creating spaces that felt calm and steady, where nothing demanded urgency and nothing provoked excitement. And within these spaces, sounds were muted, movements were deliberate, and time seemed to pass evenly, marked only by the gradual accumulation of completed work. And this accumulation was orderly, fitting neatly into existing structures that had been designed to accommodate growth without change. And as these structures expanded, they did so quietly, adding capacity rather than complexity, ensuring that the system remained familiar, even as it grew larger. And familiarity was valued because it reduced uncertainty, making each interaction predictable and each outcome expected. And this predictability reinforced patience, as waiting became a known quantity rather than a source of frustration. And over time, waiting itself became part of the rhythm, filling gaps between actions with stillness that was neither empty nor uncomfortable, but simply present. And this presence allowed the pace to remain slow without feeling stagnant, as movement continued gently beneath the surface, maintaining momentum without haste. And as momentum was maintained, it required no encouragement, driven instead by habit and expectation that were deeply ingrained. And these ingrained patterns guided behavior automatically, reducing the need for conscious decision-making and allowing actions to unfold smoothly. And this smooth unfolding further reduced friction, creating an environment where consistency was easy to maintain and deviation was rare. And when deviation did occur, it was addressed calmly, adjusted gradually, and absorbed into the existing pattern without emphasis, ensuring that the overall rhythm remained intact. And this intactness provided reassurance, reinforcing trust in the system's ability to continue functioning as it always had. And as trust deepened, it further reduced the impulse to intervene, allowing the process to operate quietly on its own terms. And this quiet operation extended across time, linking past, present, and future into a continuous stream of routine activity that did not distinguish between them. And within this stream, individual moments lost their sharpness, blending into one another until they formed a gentle, unbroken flow. And this flow carried everything within it forward, without resistance, without urgency, and without conclusion, simply moving on in the same calm, measured way, allowing tasks to be completed, records to be stored, and time to pass softly, steadily, and without calling attention to itself as the hours continued to drift onward. And as that quiet continuation remained steady, it brought with it a sense of ease that required no effort to maintain, because nothing within the process demanded acceleration or intensity, and this absence of pressure allowed everything to settle into its natural pace, where actions unfolded slowly and predictably, guided by routines that had been shaped over long stretches of time. And these routines did not seek efficiency in the modern sense, but reliability, favoring methods that were known and familiar over those that promised speed. And this preference ensured that change arrived gently, if at all, and when it did, it blended into existing patterns without altering their character. And so the work continued much as it always had, even as surroundings evolved and tools were replaced, because the underlying rhythm remained unchanged. And within this rhythm, there was little need for urgency, as tasks could always be returned to, revised, or completed later. And this understanding softened the experience of responsibility, turning it into a steady presence rather than a source of tension. And as responsibility became routine, it lost its weight, allowing attention to remain calm and evenly distributed. And this calm attention supported consistency, ensuring that details were addressed carefully without requiring heightened focus. And as a result, the quality of work remained stable, neither exceptional nor deficient, but adequate, and adequacy was sufficient, because the goal was not distinction but continuity. And continuity was achieved through repetition, patience, and acceptance, qualities that were practiced quietly and reinforced daily through small, ordinary actions. And over time, these qualities shaped not only procedures but attitudes, encouraging a way of moving through tasks that was unhurried and measured. And this way of moving reduced friction, making interactions smoother and outcomes more predictable. And predictability further reinforced patience, creating a cycle that sustained itself without intervention. And within this cycle, time felt less segmented as boundaries between tasks blurred and moments flowed into one another without clear demarcation. And this flow made long periods feel shorter, as there were few distinct events to mark their passage. Only the steady accumulation of completed work that was quietly set aside, filed, or stored. And once stored, it rested without demand, contributing to a growing archive that existed as a background presence rather than a focal point. And this background presence provided a sense of order that was felt rather than noticed, reassuring in its stability and unobtrusive in its function. And as the archive expanded, it did so in an orderly manner, guided by classifications that were familiar and rarely questioned. And these classifications simplified retrieval when necessary, though necessity was infrequent, and most of the time the records remained untouched, existing simply because they had been created. And this existence was enough, as it fulfilled the purpose of documentation without requiring further action. And so the cycle of creation and storage continued, balanced and calm, producing a steady stream of ordinary information that supported daily life without becoming its focus. And within this support structure, there was no expectation of conclusion, as each day resembled the last closely enough that the idea of an ending felt irrelevant. And instead, there was only continuation, a gentle forward movement that carried everything along evenly, allowing tasks to be completed, records to be preserved, and time to pass quietly, steadily, and without interruption. As the rhythm remained unchanged and the hours drifted softly onward, blending into one another and extending forward without pause, without emphasis, and without end. And as that forward movement continued, it did so with diminishing distinction between one moment and the next, until even the idea of progression softened into a simple sense of presence, where things were neither beginning nor ending, but merely existing in a calm and steady state. And within this state, the routines that had once required attention now unfolded almost entirely on their own, guided by familiarity and reinforced by repetition. And this familiarity removed any remaining need for anticipation, as each task arrived already understood, already accepted, and already prepared for, and so it was completed gently and set aside without reflection, joining countless others that had followed the same path. And these accumulated actions formed a quiet continuity that did not seek recognition, existing instead as a stable background that supported daily life without interrupting it. And as time passed within this continuity, it left no sharp impressions, only a soft awareness that things were moving as they always had, neither improving nor declining, simply continuing. And this continuation was enough, because it maintained order, preserved consistency, and allowed everything to remain balanced. And as balance settled in, it created a sense of calm that extended outward, touching each interaction lightly, and then receding, leaving behind no demand for response. And within this calm, there was space for rest, as nothing required immediate resolution, and waiting became a natural part of the experience rather than an interruption. And this waiting was quiet and unremarkable, filled only with the steady presence of routine and the gentle passage of time. And as moments accumulated, they blended together into a single extended present that felt smooth and unbroken. And within this present, there was no need to recall what came before or anticipate what would come next, because everything necessary was already contained within the ongoing flow. And this flow carried forward softly, maintaining its pace without effort. And as it did so, the systems that supported it continued to function as intended, recording, storing, and preserving ordinary details without emphasis. And these details rested quietly once their purpose was fulfilled, contributing to a broader sense of order that did not call attention to itself. And as this order remained intact, it reinforced the stability of the whole, ensuring that nothing needed to change in order for things to continue. And so the process reached a natural resting point, not because it concluded, but because it no longer needed to speak, having said all that was required through its steady presence. And in this resting point, there was silence, calm and stillness, where the rhythm slowed gently and the movement softened, allowing everything to settle into place. And as it settled, The story itself faded into the background, becoming indistinguishable from the quiet routine it described. And there was nothing more to add, nothing more to record, and nothing more to expect. Only the soft continuation of time itself, moving onward without sound, without urgency, and without any need to be noticed until even the words grew quiet and the moment became still, and the story, having done what it was meant to do, came gently to rest.